I've got the pleasure of introducing you to Shay Hurst and Derek Lee. Shay is a software engineer for Logic Apps, and Derek Lee is a program manager for Azure Logic Apps. They're going to show you how to build fast, resilient, and low-cost Logic Apps and give you some fresh tips on how new features will enable rapid integration development. I'll give you Shay and Derek. Go for it.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. How are you doing? Let's get started. Let's talk about hacking Logic Apps. So I have Shay joining me today. She's from the Logic Apps engineering team. So a lot of feature that we showed today and yesterday is done by Shay and the team. So thank for them. And we're just here talking about the things that they have done. So in this session, we'll talk about new features that we just shipped recently that I think will really increase your productivity, that will help you more easily build complex and advanced Logic Apps. And we'll show you some tips and tricks, some best practices, and best kept secret. I did this last year, and I hope you like it. And just like last year, this is going to be brand new content that's never shown before. So every single slide that you will see are prepared specifically for this session. So let's get started, and we'll start with inline code. For inline code, well, people have been asking me, this question was like, what's its utility and what's its relationship with Azure Function? To understand that, we have to step back and really take a look at the value proposition for Logic Apps. Right? So with Logic Apps, we say it helps you to connect systems and services that your business runs on, and you don't even have to write a single line of code if you don't want to. Now, I want to emphasize that you don't have to write a single line of code if you don't want to. We never said you never write a single line of code. Because let's be honest, data ain't perfect. So if we're talking about using Logic App to get data from somewhere and then sending it to some downstream systems, very often you have to massage the data just a little bit so that it is ready to be consumed. You can use the built-in data operations. You can use workflow expressions if it's simple enough. Or you may have to go to Azure Functions or build your own API apps to do the more complex transformation. But very often when we look at what people do, you really just want to write a few lines of code that can run in a split second. But yet we ask you to do all these gymnastics using different services and figure out how to connect them together with Logic Apps. And that's the idea behind inline code. When you want to write a few lines of code to do some fast processing, we give you this inline code action so you can do that from right within the Logic Apps. Plus, we give you the ability to reference what we call workflow context. So using the token picker, you can consume data directly from previous actions. You don't have to worry about how to get that data and send it to Azure Functions, and then in Azure Function, how do you reference that data and then eventually send that back to Logic App? Because when we look at the telemetry, a high percentage of the usage from Logic App to Function actually fails because people can't figure out how to do it. But with inline code, well, we do it for you. So let's jump into a demo.
Okay, so hi, I'm Shay, as Derek mentioned. I'm a back-end engineer with the Azure Logic Apps, and inline code is actually a feature that I worked on, and so if you find any bugs, you can probably talk to me about that. Hopefully there aren't too many. But yeah, so Derek kind of gave you an overview of the feature, and I'm going to go through a couple of demos now so you can kind of get an idea of when you might want to use this. Obviously, there's a lot of things you can do with it because you're writing the code yourself. So a lot of restrictions that you might have had before are now going to be lifted. So this is just going to be a little example. We're doing a common scenario with Logic Apps is you have some data and you want to do some sort of transformation on it and then return it or do something else with it downstream. So here we just have some preset hard-coded data. And I'm just going to show an initial example where we're using the HTML table action. So this action is kind of limited. There's not a lot of things you can do with it out of the box. But it will take this JSON data here from Compose and create an HTML table. So we'll just look at that really fast to see what you get out of the box with this action. Here's the result from that, and this is just our sample data here with people's names and then the session they're doing. But you can see the name is going horizontally, and then we have the other columns, name and session, on the top. There's not much you can do with this. Like if you wanted to change this data, you can't do it easily right now with Logic Apps. So I guess enter inline code now instead. We're going to be able to customize this a lot and do really whatever we want to with the data, because now we have the power to write all the code within Logic Apps itself. So hopefully this will load, yes. So this is the inline code action. Right now we're just supporting JavaScript, but there's going to be more languages to come. Let's see if I can figure out this Mac. So as Derek had mentioned, you have access to the token picker now. So this is one of the big value adds with using the inline code action versus using the function action, which is what you would have had to have done before. So I'm just going to reference, oops, I referenced them twice. I'm just going to reference the output of that compose action. And then we've got some code here that we already wrote. But basically, this is just going to do a transpose of that original HTML table that we had seen, that before within Logic Apps you couldn't really do very much to. But we've written this code. And we're going to, oops. Gonna go put it in here. And then it's really easy to return whatever outputs you want from the inline code action back to Logic Apps. So we're just gonna return this new array, this new string that we've been appending to create our own custom HTML table. And I'm gonna return the output of the inline code action instead. We'll just save that. And then I'm going to go run this again. Hopefully it'll load. But yeah, so basically this is just obviously giving you a lot more functionality before, because now we have any of the features that JavaScript allows you to do. You can just write everything within Logic Apps. So okay, now we've done a little modification on this table. We've switched around the rows and the columns. You know, we can really do whatever we want and customize this anyway. So I'm just going to do another quick example here. You know, we can change any of these fields to create our own custom HTML. Just going to change the border and add a color here. All right, and then we'll save this again, and hopefully now we'll have a table that's even more beautiful and more customized to anything that we would want to do. So I think that's a pretty good basic example, but I have a couple of other examples that we're just going to walk through quickly. Another ask we get a lot of customers is to do regex. They'd like to be able to do some sort of matching or whatnot on some of their data within Logic Apps. And right now, there really isn't a good story for that. Derek had mentioned the template, the workflow template expression language, and you can't do regex with that. So inline code is a really great way to apply a regex. So in this example, we're just looking over some Outlook emails, and this is a beautiful regex we got somewhere off the internet that is going to match the body of the email and find any email addresses that are in the body. And so here, this is just a run that we did earlier, but you can see, you know, in a couple, 3 lines of code, all within Logic Apps itself, we're able to do this really easily. Where before, you would have had to go to functions, you know, to the separate blade, to the functions blade. You would have to create a function app. You'd have to create a function, and then write your code in there and figure out how to get your outputs in there and then how to return it. So it's a lot more work for the user, and it's a little more subject to like errors, because you could construct your object in a, you're creating the object yourself. You can't use the token picker. And so I'll just go through one more example here. So basically in this example, we're getting some data from Cosmos, which I think a lot of people probably use logic apps for often. And when we get those documents from Cosmos, you can kind of see right here, I'm sorry the edge is cut off over here, but we have all these additional properties that Cosmos has added, all these additional fields, which maybe we don't need those within our application of Logic App itself. So with inline code, we're then able to really, once again, in just a couple of lines of code here, we're able to look through all these documents and remove those extra fields that we didn't want for later down in our workflow. So here in this example, we're just removing some of those fields, and then we're also, I believe we're doing a currency transformation on the price. But it just is another example of how easy it is to do some stuff that should be easy to do in Logic Apps, but before was probably a little bit harder than you would have liked. So I think that's the end of my demo, Derek.
All right, thank you very much. So that is inline code. I hope you like it. It's in public preview right now. So if you haven't, please do give it a try. If you have any feedback, do talk to us and let us know. So when should you choose one versus the other? The way I think about this is, if I'm writing a few lines of code that will finish execution within 2-3 seconds or so, where the real limit is under 5 seconds, Logic App inline code is great for that. But if we're talking about 200 lines of code that's in like 5-10 different methods, that I want proper source control, and I want to be able to set a breakpoint and watch some variables to be able to debug it, then go to function proper. Right? So one doesn't compete with the other, but rather complement, depending on what scenario you are trying to target. So we just shipped this to public preview. We are thinking about features that we can add to inline code next. These are a list of things that we are considering. Again, do come and talk to us if anything particular jumps out, or if it's missing and you want us to focus on something else. So let me walk you through these. Inline code in integration service environment. You are paying us a lot of money when you use ICE. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to use inline code. We're working on that right now and should be available pretty soon. Inline code without the need of integration account. Who wants that? For those people who have used inline code now. So it is a dependency that we require you to have integration accounts to use inline code for now. We want to lift that limit off once we go before we go GA. But there are just some more complexity that we have to figure out, especially when we have to run your code in this multi-tenant environment. With that said, we do want to give you some premium capabilities with integration account should you link to one. Maybe that means bigger content size. Instead of 50 megabyte, you can go higher. Instead of 5-second execution, you can run it a little bit longer. And maybe we can allow you to use different modules, right? So we are talking about JavaScript. If there's a particular node module that you want to use, we want to give you the ability to say, I want to require that module and be able to do some operations based on the functionality it provides. And additional languages. So the two that we're looking at is PowerShell and C#. Again, we're welcoming your feedback, so depending on what you like, let us know, and we'll take that into consideration. That is inline code. The next thing I want to talk about is VS Code. A lot of the coding stuff going on here today. So we shipped VS Code when? I think September-ish of last year to public preview. And we have been adding features, not a lot, but a carefully curated list of features. So we have The Cloud Explorer, in that you can look at your Logic app that had already been deployed. We added the read-only designer so you can visualize the workflow that you have just built. But we just released a new version to public preview this morning. So if you get on to VS Code and just get the update, there should be some new capabilities that you will have less than 24 hours ago that you don't. Local project. So we now give you the ability to create a local project for Logic apps within VS Code. The idea is then, with this local project, you can choose Logic apps that you have already built on the cloud. You can add it to your local project, or you can add some new ones to it. But not only that, you will be able to build this local project, so you get an ARM deployment template for your Logic apps. So no longer do you have to handcraft that ARM deployment template. We also give you an out-of-the-box YAML definition for the Azure DevOps pipeline. So you take this local project, you push that onto Azure DevOps, and you will have a DevOps pipeline set up and ready to go. Of course, most likely you will want to do more customizations, have a gated release, and have your dev test stage and production, but at least this gives you a good starting place that you can start party with it. So let's take a look at a quick demo. So here I have an organization, I call it Contoso integration in our Microsoft Azure DevOps tenant. So I'm going to create a brand new project with nothing in it. So let's call it integration 19. The only thing I have to do with this new project is to connect it to Azure, so that it has the required credential to be able to do the deployment. So I go into project settings, I say I want to create a new service connection for the pipeline. Because I'm signed in with my Microsoft credentials, so it knows what set of Azure subscriptions that I have access to. So I'm gonna use the Logic Apps PM one. And here is the subscription ID, and I believe I have a resource group in the UK sales region called Delhi int 19. So let me go create that. We'll take a second, and while it's being created, I'm gonna switch back to to the Logic App extension in VS Code. You will see we added new icons here, so I can create a new project. So I will browse, and I will just create a new folder. Actually, let me go up one level. This was the one that I was trying last night, so we'll call it int 19. And that's it. I'm really just choosing a folder where I want my stuff to be stored. I actually don't want this file, and I don't need a workspace. Okay, so now, let's see. Let's add a folder. I have my int 19 here. Cool. So then what I can do, these are the set of Logic apps I already have in my Azure subscription. So I right-click and say I will just add a few to my project. And if I switch back, so here you see I already have some Logic apps. And what I can do is definition to my local project. So there are a few things that I will have to configure. It needs to know the connection name. That's the one that I just created, Logic Apps PM. It needs to know the resource group I want to deploy it to. So it's going to be that value, and we know it's going to be in UK sales. What it will do now is generate 3 files. So this is the ARM template parameter, and then the YAML file I mentioned for Azure DevOps. Cool. So now, and I can just show you really quick, here is the ARM template that is generated automatically for you, and you don't have to do a thing. All right, now I'm going to switch back here. My connection is created, and I can just show you the repository is empty at the moment. So let me copy the command. We'll go into, what did we call it, int 19. Do a git init, git add every file, and commit. And have to remember how to exit Vim. Not that, but that. All right, so I'm going to paste in the command and just push the local project I just created onto the cloud. Now let's refresh, and here are my files. And the only thing I have to do from this point is go to pipeline and say I want a new pipeline. It's going to be based on my repository. And it picks up the YAML file that we generated for you. And I can just run it. So it will take a few seconds for it to run, but it will basically grab all the artifacts and call the resource group deployment template and push your stuff onto the cloud. So it just completed and then has some cleanup tasks to do, but you got the idea. This is the local project for VS Code. So again, it's available today, so go ahead and download and give it a try, and we would love to hear your feedback. What is next with VS Code? These are the things we're considering. Better template generation. So when we generate the template, I think we can do a better job to help you to parameterize your logic app. So we want to work on that. We want to give you maybe a better connection management experience, which we lack today in VS Code. Maybe designer improvement. We only have read-only designer today. Maybe we can give you a editable designer. But if I'm honest, we are not going to do all of these because we only have so many people. If you want secure input and output, if you want more ICE features, if you want better connectors and more connectors, we can only do so much. But the code is open sourced on GitHub. So for the first 10 people who create a pull request and get approved, you will get some special gift from me. So there is the repository. Please take a note, or you can just search VS Code Agile Logic Apps, and that should be the first result in your search query. So again, we welcome your contribution, and we appreciate it. And hopefully, we can together make VS Code extension much better for Logic Apps. And it's going to be really cool. All right, let's switch gear a little bit. Let's talk about tips and tricks. I call it tips of the trade for Logic Apps. You know, the thing I like coming to Integrate, the conference, well, apart from I got to travel to London on company's dime, is that I get to share these tips and tricks with you that I don't really get to at pretty much any other place. The content is either too advanced for the other audience, or for the scenario they're trying to use Logic App to solve, they simply don't need these kind of things. But I think for integration expert like you guys, these are going to be the great tools to have on your belt when you have to solve the challenging problems. So let's take a look at them. Trigger condition. So this is the first one I want to talk about. Now, when you build event-driven logic app, when you say, oh, I'm building a logic app that's triggered by a file system whenever a new file is added, you may not want to monitor and process all the files. You may only care about file with certain prefix, for example. If you're building a logic app that is triggered by Outlook email, you may only care about the email that's coming from your boss and not everyone else. So you can do that today. You can use the condition action, right? You have the trigger, you add an action right after that, and that works. But there are some drawbacks with that approach. First is, even for the runs that you don't really care about, it still triggers a run, so it ends up polluting your run history. You have a bunch of runs that doesn't really do anything, and it's really difficult for you to find the ones that you care about. And you pay extra. You have to pay for that actual execution of the condition action. But you can do the same thing with conditions, but with it inside the trigger. So we don't have designer support today, but please do give this a try. And we are looking at the telemetries, and if more people are using this feature, we'll prioritize it accordingly. So what I do is I just add the condition action. I build whatever criteria that I want to check, and then I simply move that JSON block up to the trigger. So here is an example where I say, I'm building a request trigger in Logic App, but I really only care about those ones that has a foo property in the body that equals to bar. Again, you can change that depending on what kind of problem you are trying to solve. Some really cool stuff here. run against an older version of the logic app. Now, this is only available to request response logic apps, but I think there are some really interesting use case that you can do with it. One example is, let's say I'm building an API using logic apps, and I'm putting that behind API management, but whenever I update my logic app or my implementation of my API, I want to slowly roll it out. I don't want to blast it out to the world all at once. So what you can do is, instead of having API management point always to the latest version of your logic app, you can have it point to still the latest, but to that specific version of the logic app. And with that, you can make update to the logic app, and no one will see that because no one will be calling that endpoint through API management. Once you have validated that, you can add API management policy. Here I have some code that basically generated a random number between 1 and 100. And I say, oh, if it's less than 20, I'm going to go to one endpoint. Otherwise, I'm going to some other endpoint, right? So by leveraging API management policy, you can direct 20% of the traffic to the new endpoint, and you can leave the other 80% to the old implementation. And once that turns out to be working, you can change the ratio and eventually move all the traffic to the new one. So the first line in the code snippet is how you can get a callback URI or the request trigger URI for a particular version of the logic app. So the only thing you have to add is, well, there is the version. So you do a post, and then you're good to go. Sliding window trigger. So we added a new timer-based trigger called sliding window. And I have people asking me, like, why are there two triggers that does the same thing? The answer is pretty simple, because they are not the same. Sliding window trigger has some unique characteristics that I think is really interesting, especially if you're using logic app for data processing. Sliding window trigger is what we call a fixed-sized, non-overlapping, and continuous time interval coverage trigger. So you can have a sliding window trigger that starts from midnight. You say my window is 1 hour. So we'll cover from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, and slide over, right? See why we call it sliding window trigger? You can say, oh, recurrence trigger can do that, but there's more. It will backfill in case of logic app runtime failure, in case you disabled your logic app, or if you configure a logic app to run in a singleton fashion, and this one particular run just happened to run longer than an hour, it will still backfill. And the trigger output start and end time for that trigger. So here on the screenshot, you can see the output from the trigger has a window start and a window end. So I did this a few days ago. And what happened here is I triggered the first run at 2:49 p.m. And I immediately disabled the logic app. And I waited for 5 minutes before I re-enabled it. Now, with a regular recurrence trigger, it will be like, oh, I'm re-enabled. I'm just going to start from here and continue with my journey, triggering a logic app based on the time you have configured. But you see, sliding window trigger actually backfilled, right? At 2:54 p.m., it actually backfilled all the missed sliding window. And for each of the window, it covers that unique time interval. And this is really important when you have to resubmit your logic app. Let's say I have a sliding window that runs every hour, and between 1 and 2, the data quality isn't good, so it wasn't able to run successfully. When I resubmit that trigger, because trigger remembers the start and end time for that window, you don't have to do all these gymnastics to figure out, oh, for a resubmission, I have some other logic. It's done for you. So that's really convenient. And then there's trigger delay. So whenever you're processing telemetry data, data usually comes in a few minutes later, right? So you have a client that generates the telemetry, and the client may batch those uploads because they want to save some bandwidth. And then has to go through multiple components in the entire telemetry pipeline before it reaches to your data store. So if you are going to process data from 1 to 2 p.m., you probably want to do that at 2:05 or 2:10 instead of at 2 o'clock. And delay will help you to do that. So here I'm configuring a 5-minute delay. And so my logic app will trigger at 5 minutes after each each clock, and but the start time and end time will still be 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and etc. So you don't have to do all the compose action and minus 5 minutes plus 5 minutes to do that. We do it for you. So that is sliding window trigger. Now let's talk about what's on Derek's mind. So these are some other things that we're considering, and I just want to give you get your feedback. We're probably not going to do an emoji generator connector. I mean, you can do that yourself, but we're probably not going to do it. I already mentioned that we want to add more stuff to inline code and VS Code. How about the new designer? So the problem with the current designer is, well, I mean, it was done a few years ago. And when we look at the telemetry, the complexity of the logic apps that people are building has been increasing. People are building more and more complex logic apps, and it's a good sign. That means people are using logic app for more serious stuff. But as you get more actions onto the canvas, as you start having more parallel branches and conditions, I think we can do a better job in utilizing the real estate that we have on the screen. How about the new and better token picker? I mean, we have the token picker. I think that's one of the highlights of Logic App, but when you have to do the workflow expression, when you have to switch between those two tabs, when it's hidden in the corner, I think we can do a better job there. Let's see, do I have anything else? Oh, that's it. So, I mean, these are some of the things that I'm personally considering. It's something that we are exploring. We are trying to gather some feedback in terms of the pain point that people have. None of these has been committed, but again, do talk to us and let us know if this is something that you want. 429s. 429s are bad, right? So that means you are being throttled. So just have a few extra slides. We can talk about 429 a little bit. So where are 429s coming from? It can come from the connector. This is most often the case. So you're sending too much request to a particular connector, and connector is telling you, well, you have to slow down. Or it may be the service that the connector is connecting to, right? So the SQL connector can throttle you, or the SQL server can throttle you. Then you have to understand the connector throttling model. We have two different models. In the consumption plan, it's throttled on a connection level. And in eyes, Kevin mentioned that yesterday, is throttled on a connector level. Right? So connector is this service that you're connecting to, and connection is that contains your credentials and stuff. So how can we improve if you are running into problems and you are seeing 429s? Couple of thoughts here. Again, depending on a specific scenario, you may do something differently. Consider using a singleton logic app to the connector to avoid parallel branches and multiple instances fighting over the rate limit. Right? So what happens very often is logic app respect the 429s and the retry after header, so we know we have to wait for some time before retry again. But if you have many logic apps all running at the same time, or if you have multiple branches, like a for each loop running at the same time, they will fight with each other. Right? So I know I have to wait for 30 seconds, but before I get to retry again, someone will have taken up that read limit. But if you have one logic app, then that logic can focus on sending the message, and you won't have that problem anymore. You can also consider using a different connection per action or per logic app. Tiago mentioned this briefly yesterday. Is a great thing to do. So even if you're connecting to the same service, let's say you're getting some message from service bus, and then you're sending message to the same service bus, you can still use two different connections. You don't have to use the same one. And then there's this trick to use multiple connections per single action. This is something really cool. I didn't know this existed a while ago. So what I did here is I created 3 connections to service bus, right? Service bus 1, 2, and 3. And the connection object that sits in a given action, the send message action. So at runtime, I'm actually generating a number between 1 and 3, and I'm choosing that particular connection to use. So theoretically, I can have 10 service bus connections, and then I can choose randomly from those 10 and scale my limit linearly. So that is that. Again, I hope you like it. I hope that you would come to us and let us know which features that you value the most, what you want us to work on. And we have 5 minutes-ish for Q&A if anyone has any questions.
Do you know if PowerShell inline code is going to be PowerShell 6 or 7?
So the question is, do you know what version of the PowerShell will we support with inline code? We don't. So please let us know if you need a particular version. We are also interested in the scenario that you want to use PowerShell in conjunction with inline code. Right? So in my opinion, it's for DevOps scenarios. Right? I may want to call another Azure DevOps commandlet, and I want to do some operations. But that may not be what you want to use PowerShell for. So definitely come to us and let us know.
What is the reason to choose for only a 5-second timeout on inline code?
Cool. So the question is, why 5 seconds? Again, we are putting this limit here to help you make a decision on whether to use inline code or Azure Function proper. Right? The idea is, if your code takes longer than 5 seconds to write, it's probably complex enough that you want it to be an Azure function. Now, that is not saying we will not change the limit. This is in public preview. So if you are running into issue that says, oh, my code only takes like 8 seconds to run, and I really want inline code, do let us know. And we're pretty flexible with the limit, and we can tweak it to meet where you are.
Hey, Derek. Great talk. Thank you. My name is Piotr Kierklewski from version 1. Is there going to be a Beanstalk-like mapper for graphical one for logic apps without the need to subscribe to the integration accounts?
Sure. So the question is, will there be a mapper for Logic App that's kind of separate from integration account and stuff? It's something that we're looking into. Right. So I think there are a few different things when it comes to the mapper. There's the tools that help you to generate the mapper, right? The XSLT file, and we are releasing the EIP extension to VS Code 2019 in the coming month. So there will be that. But we're also looking into potentially a consumption model where you can perform XML transformation and validation. So again, come to us and let us know why you prefer one way versus the other, and we can have a conversation.
Thank you. I have a question about liquid maps. Mm-hmm. We use that sometimes, and we have trouble debugging those maps. Is there already a solution for that, how to do that, or not?
Sure. I will introduce you to folks sitting here who are from the engineering team as well as the enterprise integration team. And I'm personally not an expert, to be honest, when it comes to Liquid, but come to us, and I'm sure there are people who can help you with it.
Hello. No? Okay. So one of the challenges we have seen also when it comes to export a complex or large logic app in a designer mode. Sometimes we need to just share that with management that they don't have access to the portal, sure. Right? So then we need to expand that out and zoom out. Then it turns out you can see. Okay, so that is a suggestion that I would like to do, yep. Right? To be able to export that out in a designer mode. That's good to share.
Sure. So the comment is, it's rather difficult to export the logic app in the designer mode, and it's not really for sharing the code, but I assume rather for presentation purposes, where I want to show my boss, this is the logic app that I've built. I think the new designer exploration that we're working on will potentially help that. We want to give you a much better and fluid presentation of the dependency graph. So stay tuned with that. There are also some other explorations that we can follow up offline that may be of help as well. But we hear that a lot. People not only want to share the actual thing, but people want to share the ideas, and we want to help you to do that as well. Thank you. Again, come to us, talk to us, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Cove.co